Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, January 23rd issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article today, Supreme Court hearing reveals unease over threats to Fed independence. As the justices weighed the consequences of allowing President Trump to fire a Federal Reserve official, the president reprised his pressure campaign on the central bank. By Colby Smith and Tony Rahm. The looming Supreme Court decision about whether President Trump can fire a Federal Reserve governor, Lisa D. Cook, has more at stake than whether she may stay on at the central bank. As the justices signaled throughout oral arguments on Wednesday, they are simultaneously grappling with a much more existential question about the independence of the Fed and how insulated it should be from the White House. That fundamental issue arose repeatedly over a roughly 2-hour hearing as the Trump administration defended the president's decision to try and fire Ms. Cook for cause. For a judicial body often fraught with division over Mr. Trump's sweeping claims to executive power, the Supreme Court found rare moments of unity in questioning the economic impact of the president's efforts to meddle with the Fed. Just before the Supreme Court hearing, Mr. Trump reprised his attacks on the central bank and its reluctance to slash borrowing costs well beyond what many economists believe is warranted, given America's economic strength. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Mr. Trump lamented not having control over what policies officials pursue once they joined the institution. That barb appeared to be directed at Jerome H. Powell, the Fed chair, whom Mr. Trump quickly soured on after elevating him to lead the central bank in his first term. Mr. Powell has refused to cow to the president's demands to lower borrowing costs, prompting his ire. Earlier this month, the Justice Department sent grand jury subpoenas to Mr. Powell as part of a criminal investigation into his handling of renovations underway at the central bank's headquarters in Washington. Mr. Powell, in a blunt video message, said the legal inquiry was about coercing the Fed into cutting interest rates. The president's explicit threats against the Fed were not mentioned during the hearing on Wednesday, yet the justices appeared cognizant of the enormity of the decision before them. In an early exchange, Justice Amy Coney Barrett pressed D. John Sauer, the Solicitor General, about warnings the justices had received in Friends of the Court briefs from economists, who argued that allowing the president to fire Ms. Cook could cause a recession. One of those briefs was signed by every living former chair of the Fed's Board of Governors, Alan Greenspan, Ben S. Bernanke, and Janet L. Yellen, along with 6 former Treasury secretaries and many other high-ranking former officials appointed by presidents of both parties. They said that allowing Ms. Cook's removal would erode public confidence in the Fed's independence and threaten the long-term stability of our economy. Mr. Sauer sought to downplay those risks on Wednesday, pointing to the fact that financial markets did not collapse in the wake of Ms. Cook's ousting last August. He called it a kind of natural experiment, so to speak. But Ms. Barrett appeared unswayed. "I don't want to be responsible for quantifying that risk," she said. "I'm a judge, not an economist." She then mused about whether the presence of this risk counseled caution on our part. Ms. Barrett was joined by other justices who were focused on the economic consequence if the Fed's independence were to be eroded. "We know that the independence of the agency is very important, and that the independence is harmed if we decide these issues too quickly and with not due consideration," said Justice Sonia Sotomayor, adding that further legal review makes the most sense to the public's confidence and to the world's confidence about the due process of law. The Trump administration tried to frame the matter much differently. Pressed by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson later about an adverse effect on the public, Mr. Sauer argued that the greatest threat would be for Ms. Cook to remain at the Fed. "We assert grievous, irreparable injury to the public perception to the Federal Reserve of allowing her to stay in office," he said. Not all the justices seemed convinced. Later in the hearing, Justice Brett Kavanaugh repeatedly pressed Mr. Sauer to explain the purpose of Fed independence. Eventually, he raised the issue at the heart of the inquiry. the extent to which permitting the president to fire officials more easily would weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve. Thinking big picture, what goes around comes around, Mr. Kavanaugh later added. History is a pretty good guide. Once these tools are unleashed, they are used by both sides, and usually more the second time around. Graham Steele, a longtime financial regulation lawyer and a former Treasury Department official, said the justices' comments reflected their concerns about the real-world stakes of central bank independence and the potential economic harm caused by executive partisan influence over monetary policy. Mr. Steele said he viewed it as a positive for Governor Cook's argument because they signal an attentiveness to the fact that the stakes of the case are much bigger than just her seat on the board. Catherine Judge, a financial regulation expert at Columbia Law School, noted that concerns about a significant economic fallout were notably lacking in the legal fights that arose over Mr. Trump's moves to fire members of other independent agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission and the National Labor Relations Board. In those hearings, the justices appeared much more worried about the harm to the president that would arise from allowing somebody to stay in office, she said. Ms. Judge said Wednesday's hearing was a good day for Governor Cook. It would be the shock of my legal career if Donald Trump wins this right now, said Peter Conti Brown, an expert on Fed governance at the University of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court views Fed independence as central to the vitality of the United States. Removal protection is seen as one of the most important guardrails bolstering the Fed's independence. By limiting the president's ability to remove officials for any stated reason, Congress sought to reduce the likelihood that the president could retaliate on the Fed if it pursued policy settings that went against the White House's wishes. Kush Desai, a White House spokesman, said in a statement on Wednesday that the administration had satisfied the burden under the law to seek Ms. Cook's removal. The removal of a governor for cause improves the Federal Reserve Board's accountability and credibility for both the markets and the American people, he said. Mr. Trump has openly vied for a majority of supporters on the Fed's board so that he can have more sway over the institution. Already, Mr. Trump has had the opportunity to fill one vacancy with top economic advisor Stephen I. Miran, who since joining the Fed in September has called for substantially lower rates. The president is also in the process of picking his replacement for Fed chair. Mr. Powell's term as head of the central bank ends in May, although his term as a governor runs through 2028. Mr. Trump has insisted that his next Fed chair must mirror his thinking in seeking swift and steep reductions in rates, even going so far as to say last month, anybody that disagrees with me will never be the Fed chairman. Daniel K. Tarullo, a former Fed governor who was a signatory on one of the Friends of the Court briefs, said this broader context only underscored just how important the Supreme Court's decision would be. The Supreme Court justices read the papers. They know what's going on, said Mr. Tarullo, adding that they appeared uncomfortable with the idea that a president had full discretion to determine what constituted cause for removal. The independence of the Fed surely is at stake here, depending on the way the court decides, he said. Few voters say Trump's second term has made the country better, poll finds. A majority of voters said that Mr. Trump had focused on the wrong priorities and that they disapproved of his handling of top issues, but the president still enjoys strong support from Republicans. By Shane Goldmacher, Ruth Egelnick, and Camille Baker. Less than a third of voters think the country is better off than it was when President Trump returned to the White House a year ago, with a wide majority saying he has focused on the wrong issues, according to a new poll from the New York Times and Siena University. A majority of voters disapprove of how Mr. Trump has handled top issues, including the economy, immigration, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and his actions in Venezuela. And significantly, a majority of Americans, 51%, said that Mr. Trump's policies had made life less affordable for them. All told, 49% of voters said the country was worse off than a year ago, compared with 32% who said it was better. The survey also revealed the extent to which Mr. Trump has polarized the nation into its furthest partisan corners, with more voters seeing him as on track to be historically bad or good than merely below or above average. Some 42% of voters said he was on track to be one of the worst presidents in American history, and 19% said he was headed to be one of the best. Mr. Trump's own job approval rating stands at 40%, down 3 points since September. His disapproval rating has crept up to 56%. Only 42% of voters rated Mr. Trump's first year as a success. One glimmer of good news for Mr. Trump is that the share of voters who say the country is on the right track, while low, has remained largely unchanged since at least April. It also remains higher than it was under his predecessor, Joseph R. Biden Jr., who on this question alienated not just Republicans and independents, but also half of Democrats. Under Mr. Trump, most Republicans still feel the country is headed in the right direction. Still, there were some signs of softening support for Mr. Trump among Republicans when it came to his approach to foreign affairs and addressing the cost of living. His lowest approval rating within his party came on his handling of the release of files related to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Only 53% of Republicans approved of his handling of that matter. Overall, only 34% of independent voters who tend to determine who wins elections approve of the job that Mr. Trump is doing. And twice as many independent voters think the country is worse off now compared with a year ago than better, 52% to 24%. In a hypothetical question about the 2026 midterm elections, voters favored a Democratic candidate over a Republican by 5 percentage points, 48% to 43%. The Democratic edge among independent voters was 15 percentage points, although a sizable share of independent voters declined to pick a preferred party. Mr. Trump will turn 80 this year and will be the oldest president ever to serve by the end of his term. Voters do not see his age as a hindrance the same way they did for Mr. Biden, with 40% saying he is too old to be effective, but 58% saying that he is not. That figure is largely unchanged since October 2024. His enduring popularity with the base presents a bind for Republican congressional candidates who must win over his supporters without repelling swing voters. In an open-ended question about what emotions Mr. Trump evokes, Democrats expressed outrage, sadness, disgust, or fear. Republicans reported pride, satisfaction, hopefulness, or relief. A small share of voters who supported Mr. Trump in 2024, around 12%, expressed emotions related to outrage, disgust, or disappointment. The economy and related topics, inflation and the cost of living, remain the top issue for American voters by far. Mr. Trump's 40% approval rating on the economy mirrored his overall standing, but other indicators showed more vulnerability, including that only 24% of voters thought he had made life more affordable, and only 34% believed he had handled the issue of the cost of living well. Only 32% of voters said the economy was better today than a year ago. At the same time, when asked about the current economy, voters gave a slightly rosier assessment than April 2025, with 29% calling the economy good or excellent now, up from 22% then. Overall, 57% of voters thought Mr. Trump was focused on the wrong issues, including a whopping 69% of voters under 30, more than any other age group. Voters whose top issue was an economic concern were more likely to say Trump was focused on the wrong issues. Voters whose top issue was immigration thought Trump was focused on the right issues. On immigration, voters are broadly more favorable on Mr. Trump's policies than on their implementation, continuing a trend seen in previous Times Siena polls. Half of voters said that they supported the Trump administration's deportations of people living in the United States without legal status, and half approved of his handling of the border between Mexico and the United States. At the same time, a sizable 61% majority, including 71% of independents, said the administration's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency had gone too far with its tactics, which have driven protests in multiple American cities. Similarly, 63% of voters said they disapproved of how ICE is handling its job. The poll was conducted in the aftermath of the shooting of Renee Good by an ICE officer in Minneapolis that spurred national attention and local protests. About 17% of Republicans said that Mr. Trump has not had a successful year so far as president, with Republicans under 45 more likely to say he was unsuccessful and focusing on the wrong issues. Most voters agree, though, that Mr. Trump had a productive year. A majority said that Mr. Trump had done about what they expected, 39%, or more, 40%. Even a majority of Democrats felt the president got done about what they expected or more. As to the quality of what he accomplished, the partisan divide ran deep. 62% of Democrats said Mr. Trump's second term had been worse than expected. Most Republicans said it was about what they expected, 48%, or better, 39%. One of Mr. Trump's central economic policies has been widespread tariffs, and 54% of voters opposed them, including 45% who strongly opposed them. Delia Mustadinagic, a 22-year-old stay-at-home mother in Portland, Oregon, who did not vote in 2024, said that the tariffs had been impacting her life. Those tariffs, she said, have been affecting a lot of people's jobs. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump returns to a familiar role, sowing trade chaos. The president's quick reversal on tariffs over Greenland was another sign of his willingness to rip up the international order, even parts of it that he himself has made. By Anna Swanson. For 4 days, President Trump had once again dangled the prospect of a transatlantic trade war as he threatened to punish European nations if they did not accede to his demands to give Greenland to the United States. The threat sent stock markets plunging and prompted a frenzy of activity, with European leaders convening emergency meetings, frantically calling the president and suspending an effort to complete a trade deal with the United States that they had painstakingly negotiated and agreed to just months before. Then Mr. Trump did what he often does. He backtracked, saying he had reached the framework of a future deal for Greenland and the Arctic. Little information about the agreement was immediately available, but Mr. Trump claimed it would be a great one for the United States. He said the tariffs he had planned to impose on 8 European countries beginning February 1st no longer needed to go into effect. Stock markets soared. The president may have walked away from a brewing trade war with Europe as quickly as he began it, but what he left in his wake was another destabilizing moment in global trade. And as those moments pile up, they are having their own effects, including increasing doubts about the value of cooperating with the president and undermining some of the trading system he and his advisors have been working to create. His approach has also pushed countries away from the United States, toward one another, and more important, toward China. In the second year of his second term, Mr. Trump has had ample opportunity to remake the global trading order in his own vision, but that doesn't seem to have quieted his urge to rip it all up. The president has continued to goad the country's closest trading partners with new tariff ultimatums and threatened to upend even his own trade agreements, sometimes before they have been completed. Global businesses and foreign leaders had hoped that this year would be the end of tariff uncertainty. Although tariffs would be significantly higher, at least the world would settle into more predictability as the American president's trade vision was cemented in a series of trade agreements between the United States and its trading partners. But Mr. Trump appears to be more eager than ever to inject fresh chaos into the global trading order. Concessions by trading partners haven't calmed that urge. Over the past year, many governments took the approach of trying to placate Mr. Trump. Country after country dropped their own tariffs and came to terms with higher American taxes on their exports in return for trade deals that included less punishing tariffs than the president had threatened. The only notable exception to the trend was China. Instead of conceding to Mr. Trump's demands, Beijing went tit for tat in a trade clash that ended up hurting American farmers, car makers, and defense manufacturers, as well as the Chinese economy. That approach, which was made possible by America's deep reliance on China for critical minerals as well as agriculture exports, forced Mr. Trump to back down. Despite threats of retaliation, Europe also adopted a conciliatory approach. European leaders grudgingly acknowledged the president's point that their unbalanced trade was a problem and promised to lower tariffs on American products even as the United States drastically raised its own tariffs on European exports. The European Union secured a trade deal that imposed a 15% tariff on their imports and the promise of peace, but it didn't last for long. As Europe was struggling to get its parliament to approve the deal's required changes, Mr. Trump issued threats against Greenland that were too drastic for European leaders to accept. After a menacing speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland on Wednesday, in which Mr. Trump called for Denmark to sell Greenland to the United States and issued veiled threats to both Europe and Canada, the European Union formally suspended its work on its trade arrangement with the United States. A senior European official suggested on Sunday that if the Greenland situation was successfully resolved, the trade deal could still ultimately be completed. The EU deal is not the only trade arrangement the president has called into question of late. This month, Mr. Trump dismissed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that he had negotiated and signed in his first term as irrelevant, raising doubts about whether the pact will survive negotiations this year. For many North American companies, significant tariff exemptions under USMCA have been the reason they haven't suffered more in Mr. Trump's trade war. Adding more uncertainty to the picture is the fact that the Supreme Court is reviewing Mr. Trump's use of an emergency law to issue many of his tariffs. If the Supreme Court rules against Mr. Trump, that could usher in another period of volatility, as many of the president's tariffs are struck down, but then replaced with other levies. I don't think this is the year tariff uncertainty passes, said Edward Alden, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. The past year suggests that what Mr. Trump respects the most is a forceful response from a country able to wield economic damage to the United States, like China, not an effort toward cooperation. The president also appears to see little downside to the madman theory of foreign policy, keeping foreign leaders convinced he is erratic and unpredictable. But critics say the approach has other downsides. As the United States becomes viewed as a less reliable partner, other governments have sought out business and trade agreements elsewhere or made preparations to stand more on their own. Often, that has involved countries drawing closer to China, strengthening the geopolitical influence of America's main rival. This month, Canada struck a new partnership with China that would allow Beijing to export more electric vehicles to North America, among other changes. To respond to the Greenland threats, the European Union has discussed deploying an anti-coercion instrument on the United States that it had developed for dealing with rivals like China. In his remarks at Davos, Li Feng, China's vice premier, emphasized China's partnership with other countries and said it had remained steadfast in supporting multilateralism and free trade. Mr. Alden said he believed Mr. Trump's tactics would force the Europeans into a change of direction from their former strategy of appeasing the United States. There had been a lot of grumbling in Europe that the government had given away too much to Mr. Trump, Mr. Alden said. This incident is likely to strengthen all the skeptics who will say, look, it doesn't matter what we give Trump. He's going to want more, he added. Trump has succeeded in making China the lesser of the two threats to the global trade and economic system, and that's quite an accomplishment, because China poses all sorts of threats to the global trade and economic system, Mr. Alden said. In his remarks on Wednesday, Mr. Trump argued that the United States had provided for Europe's defense and got nothing for it. But Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, suggested in his speech that what the United States had received for providing the world with public goods, like collective security, open sea lanes, and a stable financial system, was the rest of the world going along with its agenda. Mr. Carney said pointedly that powerful countries were now using economic integration as a vehicle of coercion, and he called for Canada to follow its own path. The middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, he said. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, also called for building a new form of European independence during her speech at Davos on Monday. Nostalgia will not bring back the old order, she said, adding, if this change is permanent, then Europe must change permanently too. Mr. Trump's advisors had downplayed the president's threats. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, referred to the tensions with Europe as a kerfuffle and predicted it's going to end in a reasonable manner. But on Tuesday night, as Mr. Lutnick addressed attendants at a dinner, he was reportedly heckled by former Vice President Al Gore, and Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, walked out. On Monday, the Chinese embassy in the United States had posted an AI-generated video on X of Uncle Sam burning a paper marked "Rules" and laughing amid piles of burning rubble. Jack Colvin, the president of the National Foreign Trade Council, a Washington-based business association, said the Greenland threats felt different. They were more than just the latest example of the president using tariffs as a foreign policy tool, he said. We are rapidly alienating one of our most important geopolitical allies, when our focus should be on building on the progress that the president has made in the commercial relationship and uniting to address the growing geostrategic threat from China, he added. Matthew Ryan, head of market strategy at the global financial services firm Ebury, had predicted that Mr. Trump would back down. He pointed out that prediction markets had pointed toward the tariffs not going into effect and said his base case was for a TACO, an acronym meaning Trump always chickens out, that traders coined last year after Mr. Trump frequently backed down from tariff threats. As we know from recent history, Trump uses these tariffs as a blunt instrument and a negotiating lever to pull to get his way on the world stage. But Mr. Ryan added, this cavalier stance is becoming an extremely risky tactic. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. What's behind this staggering drop in the murder rate? No one knows for sure. A decline in homicides across the country was a stunning reversal after crime rose during the pandemic. By Sheila Dewan and Lazaro Gamio. Last year will likely register the lowest national homicide rate in 125 years and the largest single drop on record, according to a new analysis of 2025 crime data. Violence has been falling for several years, but last year, for the first time, all 7 categories of violent crime tracked by the analysis fell below pre-pandemic levels. The numbers provide further evidence that the surge in violence in the early 2020s was a departure during a time of massive social upheaval, not a new normal. The analysis of data from 40 cities by the Council on Criminal Justice, a nonpartisan think tank, found across-the-board decreases in crime last year compared to 2019. 25% fewer homicides, 13% fewer shootings, and 29% fewer carjackings. Between 2024 and 2025, only drug crimes went in the wrong direction, but they were still lower than in 2019. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has not yet released nationwide crime data for all of 2025, but statistics published by cities and collected by independent researchers are already telling the latest chapter of a remarkable story. In just half a decade, cities have gone from upswings in murder and mayhem, the likes of which some had not seen in 25 years, to declines themselves worthy of headlines. The spikes began in 2020 with the shock of the global pandemic, and just a few months later, sweeping protests over police killings, both of which strained the capacity of law enforcement. The Council on Criminal Justice used available FBI data, which goes through September of last year, and other sources to estimate what the final nationwide homicide rate will be. Analysts also collected data from cities ranging in size from 180,000 residents, Cary, North Carolina, to 8.3 million, New York, to look at other categories and examine an entire year of data. Not all cities reported numbers for every crime. In many cities, the declines were staggering. Baltimore, which had high homicide numbers before COVID-19 hit, had a decrease of 60%, hitting a record low last year. Salt Lake City, Chattanooga, and El Paso, 3 very different cities with populations under 1 million, each saw their homicide rate cut roughly in half between 2019 and 2025. Of the 35 cities whose homicide rates were in the analysis, all but 8 had a lower murder rate in 2025 than before the pandemic. Those whose murder rates were still the most elevated included Milwaukee at 42% higher, Austin at 36% higher, and Minneapolis at 30% higher. Still, both Austin and Minneapolis appeared headed in the right direction, with steep declines in their homicide rates from 2024 to 2025. Even the public is starting to believe that things are improving. Typically, most people insist that crime is going up, regardless of the data. But in its annual survey of crime last October, Gallup found that only 49% of respondents said crime was worse than the year before, compared to 64% in 2024. The percentage of people who said crime in their own neighborhood was an extremely serious or very serious issue, and the percentage afraid to walk alone at night had also declined. The numbers have been at the center of heated political debate since President Trump returned to office, after he campaigned on fears of a migrant-led crime wave and complained of bloodshed and chaos in Democratic-led cities. Though crime was already declining before he took office, Mr. Trump has credited tactics such as sending in National Guard troops with extinguishing crime in Washington, and he has said that federal action has made other cities, like Minneapolis, where immigration officers are conducting what they say is the largest immigration enforcement operation in history, safer. ICE is removing some of the most violent criminals in the world from our country, Mr. Trump wrote on Truth Social earlier this week. Crime decreased more sharply in Washington as federal officers and National Guard troops gathered in the city, dampening pedestrian traffic and other activity. Still, a New York Times examination found that only 7% of immigration detainees had a prior conviction for any violent offense, and many Democratic state and local leaders, most recently Mayor Jacob Fry of Minneapolis and Governor Mike Waltz of Minnesota, have called the federal officers themselves, one of whom shot and killed a protester in her car, a threat to public safety. Experts said there is little to justify any claim that President Trump is responsible for last year's drop in crime. There are many more cities that didn't have the National Guard that saw their crime go down than cities who had the National Guard who saw their crime go down, said Alex Piquero, who served as head of the Bureau of Justice Statistics during the Biden administration and now teaches criminology at the University of Miami. In fact, researchers have long struggled to explain why crime fluctuates. Research has credited policing strategies and incarceration rates, mental health treatment and gun laws, the beautification of vacant lots, and the phasing out of lead, which impairs brain development, from gasoline in the 1970s. Improvements in life-saving medical care have also reduced homicide rate, though the new study finds that assaults also declined by 6% since 2019. Charles Fane Lehman, a senior fellow at the Policing and Public Safety Initiative of the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank, pointed to changes like the aging of America, increased obesity, and the ubiquity of surveillance through security and cell phone cameras. Basically, the structural factors in society are pushing us toward less crime, he said. Emily Owens, a University of California Irvine professor who studies how policy affects crime, said that while violence was declining, the number of people reporting that they were victims of cybercrime had soared, causing her to wonder if crime that used to happen on the streets was moving online. Cybercrime is not one of the types of crime widely reported by police departments. The way that people interact with each other has been changing dramatically and becoming much less face-to-face, which is sort of a requirement for violence, right? She said. Still, criminologists do not wholly discount the value of the multi-pronged effort that many cities mounted against violence in the past few years, including hotspot policing, summer jobs for youth, cognitive behavioral therapy, and focused deterrence, an approach that calls for paying sustained attention to the small number of people at highest risk of committing violence. Cities and states were really throwing everything they had at figuring out how to stop it, said Jennifer Doliak, who leads criminal justice research at Arnold Ventures, a philanthropic foundation. The question is, how do we harness that energy and keep it going? Like, don't take our foot off the gas, she said. We do have control over our destiny here. Ex-Uvalde officer found not guilty of endangering children in mass shooting. Adrian Gonzalez had faced 29 charges for his actions in the 2022 shooting in which 19 children were killed by a gunman at Robb Elementary School in Texas, by Edgar Sandoval. More than 3 years after a gunman massacred 21 people at Uvalde's Robb Elementary in one of the worst school shootings in U.S. history, a former school police officer was found not guilty of abandoning or endangering children. Adrian Gonzalez, the first officer to arrive at the school, was facing 29 counts of abandoning or endangering children, 19 for the dead and 10 more for survivors, after 7 hours of deliberations Wednesday. The verdict delivered a devastating blow to families of the victims and survivors who have clamored for accountability for the delayed police response on May 24, 2022. During the 3-week trial, prosecutors argued that Mr. Gonzalez, 52, failed to stop the gunman despite a witness alerting him to his whereabouts moments before the assailants stormed 2 connected classrooms. Defense lawyers persuaded the jury that Mr. Gonzalez had done the best he could with the information he had, and that at least 3 other officers had arrived seconds later and also failed to stop the gunman. They also presented evidence that Mr. Gonzalez had rushed into the building minutes after arriving, but retreated with the other officers after shooting began. Some members of the victims' families cried and shook their heads in disappointment in the courtroom after the verdict was read, but did not otherwise react. Mr. Gonzalez hugged defense attorneys after he learned of his fate and wiped tears from his eyes. Bill Turner, a special prosecutor, told the jury during closing arguments of the much-anticipated trial that Mr. Gonzalez had failed to act within the first 2 minutes of the attack, which is the time he believed most of the children and teachers died. Some of the children were shot more than a dozen times, some at close range, an expert for the prosecution testified. "You can't stand by when a child is in danger," Mr. Turner told the jury during closing arguments. "Police officers have a special duty. Stop the killing. Stop the dying, even if you are the only one there," he added. During his closing arguments, Jason Goss, a lawyer for the defense, argued that Mr. Gonzalez was singled out for the inaction of many other officers that day. "He was acting. He was trying. None of those officers are in that chair," Mr. Goss said, pointing at his client. The mass shooting took place around 11:30 a.m., days after the gunman, Salvador Ramos, just shy of his 18th birthday, purchased 2 AR-15-style rifles and more than 1,700 rounds of 5.56 millimeter hollow-point bullets. He made his way to 2 connected classrooms, 111 and 112, and unleashed a barrage of gunfire while some victims repeatedly called 911 for help. A tactical team led by Federal Border Patrol agents eventually confronted and killed the gunman. 2 teachers were also killed in the attack, but Mr. Gonzalez did not face charges in connection with their deaths. The Uvalde police response has become a lesson in what not to do during active shooter situations. Police departments in Texas and elsewhere have revised their training, including more aggressive tactics that ask officers confronting an active shooter to risk their own safety to protect civilians. In all, about 370 officers were involved in the police response that day in Uvalde. Dozens crammed into a school hallway near the 2 classrooms under siege, but most officers remained outside the campus. Only 2 officers have been charged, though others were fired or left their jobs. Leaving the courtroom on Wednesday, Jesse Rizzo, whose 9-year-old niece died in the massacre, said that not only was the gunman a monster, but Mr. Gonzalez was too for failing to stop him. "They failed us over and over," she said. An emotional Mr. Gonzalez spoke briefly after the verdict, thanking God and his lawyers. "He put them in my path," he said, holding back tears. He said he was not ready to address the families of the victims. The convictions of officers who fail to follow protocols for mass shootings are a rarity. A jury in Parkland, Florida, in the trial of a former sheriff's deputy, Scott Peterson, who was also charged with child neglect and other crimes for not confronting the gunman who killed 17 people at a high school in 2018, also found him not guilty. Mr. Turner called at least 2 witnesses to the stand who testified that Mr. Gonzalez had received active shooter training and was also a co-instructor of a similar course. A second officer, the former school police chief Pete Arredondo, is expected to face trial later this year on similar charges as Mr. Gonzalez did. Mr. Arredondo is accused of treating the incident as one involving an assailant barricaded inside, which meant trying to negotiate a surrender, and not an active shooter situation, which requires a more immediate and aggressive response. He has pleaded not guilty. Earlier in the trial, the prosecution played a long video of an interrogation of Mr. Gonzalez that took place a day after the massacre. In it, Mr. Gonzalez described following the sounds of gunfire and finding a distressed school employee who told him that a man in black was headed toward Robb Elementary. Mr. Gonzalez told the investigator that in the moments after he arrived at the school, he focused on the woman under duress and not on the gunman's movements. "It was my mistake, but it's just the adrenaline rush going and, shots fired and stuff like that," he told the investigator. In the video, Mr. Gonzalez said he waited for 3 other officers to enter the school, but all of them retreated after the gunman shot 2 of them from inside the classrooms. "Everybody flew back, so I think he got hit," he said of one of the officers. "We kind of moved back." "Never went in until I got coverage," Mr. Gonzalez said, referring to police backup. He did not shoot at the gunman, he said, because he never saw him. He then described breaking windows to help children evacuate. Melody Flores, a teacher at Robb Elementary at the time, told the jury that she was outside when she alerted an officer she assumed to be Mr. Gonzalez of the gunman's location. "I said that he was headed into the 4th grade building and we needed to stop him," Ms. Flores told the jury. "We needed to go in and stop him before he went in. He just stayed there," she said of the officer. Nico LaHood, another lawyer for the defense, poked holes in Ms. Flores' recollection of the events, including that she mistook the assailant's rifle for a handgun. She also told investigators that Mr. Gonzalez was wearing khakis and a white shirt and had a beard. He was cleanly shaven that day and wore a blue school police uniform. Mr. LaHood maintained that Mr. Gonzalez, with only a handgun, was insufficiently armed to challenge a gunman wielding a semi-automatic rifle, and that he did not have a line of sight to shoot the gunman, even after he was told of his movements. Putting himself in harm's way would have distracted the responding officers, not the gunman, Mr. LaHood told the jury. "If you are injured or killed, you're no good to the people that you're trying to help," he said. Some family members attending the trial became emotional listening to the harrowing testimony and seeing crime scene images of their children's autopsies. The judge overseeing the case, Sid Harrell, asked officers to remove the sister of one of the teachers killed, Velma Lisa Duran, after she burst into screams on Tuesday afternoon. The trial got off to a rocky start after a former teacher disclosed information during testimony that had not been shared with the defense. The revelation threw the case into legal chaos, with the judge overseeing the case ordering the jury to disregard her testimony. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. 3 dead after shooting in rural Australian town. The killings happened on a day when Australians were honoring the victims of the Bondi Beach massacre and just after gun laws were tightened. By Laura Chung. 3 people were shot dead in a rural Australian town on Thursday, the police said, days after the country passed stricter gun laws in the wake of a mass shooting last month. Emergency services were called to Lake Cargaligo in New South Wales, more than 300 miles west of Sydney, at 4:40 p.m. after reports that shots had been fired into a vehicle. A woman and a man were found dead in a car, said the New South Wales Police Assistant Commissioner for the region, Andrew Holland. Shortly afterward, he said, the police were called to a second crime scene and found 2 more people with gunshot wounds, a woman who died and a man who was taken to a hospital in serious condition. In total, 3 people have died, 2 females and 1 male, Mr. Holland said. The assailant was still at large, according to the authorities, who urged people to stay indoors. Any death in a small country town is confronting, but again, a scene where you have people shot by firearms is obviously going to make people very, very tense and very, very concerned, Mr. Holland said. He said it was too early in the investigation to speculate on the relationship between the attacker and the people who were shot. Australia is still reeling from a mass shooting last month in which 2 gunmen targeted a Jewish community celebration, killing 15 people and wounding dozens of others. On Thursday, the country observed a national day of mourning to commemorate those who died in the massacre at Bondi Beach in Sydney, which the authorities have deemed a terrorist attack. Gun violence is rare in Australia. The country introduced strict gun control measures almost 30 years ago after a gunman opened fire on a small Tasmanian town and killed 35 people. Since then, the country has been a model for gun control in the eyes of many. This week, Australia passed new laws to strengthen gun restrictions through a national gun buyback, import limits on firearms, and tightening background checks. It is a bid to crack down on the more than 4 million firearms in Australia, a record high, according to the authorities. After Trump's ultimatum, Greenland talks include sovereign U.S. bases and no drilling for Russia. Negotiators have discussed proposals to check Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic and transfer sovereignty over pockets of Greenlandic land to the United States, an idea opposed by Denmark. By Jim Tankersley, Laura Jakes, and Adam Goldman. Discussions to resolve the future of Greenland have focused in recent days on proposals to increase NATO's presence in the Arctic, give America a sovereign claim to pockets of Greenland's territory, and block potentially hostile adversaries from mining the island's minerals. Those elements, described by 8 senior Western security and diplomatic officials, offer the fullest picture yet of the contours of a potential Greenland compromise that President Trump announced on Wednesday without details. His move appeared to at least temporarily diffuse an American-made transatlantic crisis over the Danish territory. Critically, the proposals under discussion would stop short of Mr. Trump's goal of transferring ownership of all of Greenland to the United States from Denmark, according to the officials, all of whom spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive diplomacy. The officials cautioned that many details have yet to be finalized. It is unclear if these discussions will ultimately yield agreement over the territory. Denmark, which publicly opposes ceding ownership of any Greenlandic land, may not agree to the plans on the table. Still, the officials said they were hopeful that they could simultaneously address Mr. Trump's stated concerns about securing the Arctic against possible threats from Russia and China, while holding to Europe's red line that Greenland was not for sale. To do that, the proposals would create a significant new NATO mission in the Arctic. Multiple officials have dubbed this mission Arctic Sentry in a nod to similarly named NATO missions in the Baltic Sea and Eastern Europe that are meant to counter an increasingly aggressive Russia. Update a pact signed between Denmark and the United States in 1951. The pact gives the U.S. military wide access to Greenland, an autonomous Danish territory, for operations including the construction and operation of military bases. American officials have said they are concerned that this access could be curbed or ended if Greenland were to obtain independence. NATO officials have discussed expanding the 1951 pact with a new agreement that would effectively create pockets of American soil in the territory. Such an agreement would likely be modeled on a sovereign base area agreement in Cyprus, where Britain's military bases are regarded as British territory. That would give the United States greater control over the land than it currently exerts over U.S. embassy sites. Mr. Trump and other officials have said that territory in Greenland could prove important for his plans to build a so-called Golden Dome missile defense system for the United States, which could include components stationed in Greenland. Restrict non-NATO member countries, particularly Russia and China, from obtaining rights to mine the rare earth minerals that lie deep under Greenland's ice sheet. All of those plans have been under discussion inside NATO over the last year as a direct response to Mr. Trump's stated ambitions. Since returning to the White House in 2025, Mr. Trump has described publicly with increasing intensity his desire to own Greenland. Denmark, with equal intensity, has insisted it would not sell, with Danish leaders saying that the island's fate is up to Denmark and Greenland, not NATO. Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, said on Thursday that he was not in favor of giving the United States sovereignty over military bases there. "We are ready to discuss a lot of things," Mr. Nielsen said, adding sovereignty is a red line. The idea of giving the U.S. a sovereign claim to its bases in Greenland, similar to Britain's bases in Cyprus, was raised among NATO and Western military officials on Wednesday, according to two officials, one of whom was present in those discussions. Asked for comment, General Alexis G. Grinkovich, the top NATO commander in Europe, said in a brief conversation with the New York Times on Thursday that the idea was discussed as a matter for political leaders to resolve rather than the military. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen of Denmark did not respond to a request for comment, but in a public statement on Thursday posted on social media, she appeared to accept some of the details under discussion while rejecting others, including the idea of transferring ownership of any part of Greenland. "We can negotiate on everything political, security, investments, economy, but we cannot negotiate on our sovereignty," the statement said. Mr. Trump gave almost no details of the agreement on Wednesday evening, in brief interviews with reporters in Davos that followed it, or in his public statements on social media. Asked repeatedly about the deal by reporters while flying back from Davos on Thursday, Mr. Trump offered little additional information, saying it's being negotiated. "We're all going to work together," he said, "and actually, NATO is going to be involved with us." A senior Danish official, who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive diplomacy, said there have been no direct discussions between Denmark and the U.S. about the possibility of granting the U.S. sovereign parcels of land. Asked about the proposed agreement, Admiral Giuseppe Cavo Dragoni, the Italian chairman of the NATO Military Committee, said at a press briefing on Thursday that officials were at the very early stage of creating a framework for securing the Arctic and Greenland. General Grinkovich said, "We've done no planning yet for the joint Arctic operations." He added, "We have not received political guidance to move out." There was a spreading sense of relief on Thursday among European leaders that the escalating crisis over Greenland had been diffused. In a speech in Davos, Switzerland on Wednesday, Mr. Trump ruled out using military force to take the island, but raised the specter of imposing economic pain on allies if he didn't get what he wanted. Then, that evening, he abruptly announced he had reached a deal with Mr. Rutte, and he called off the tariffs he had planned to impose on imports from Denmark and many of the European countries that had risen to its defense over Greenland. Some European leaders on Thursday welcomed Mr. Trump's announcement and expressed optimism that it would eventually result in a victory for Arctic security and NATO unity. "We will protect Denmark, Greenland, the North, from the threat posed by Russia," Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, said in a speech at Davos on Thursday morning. "We will uphold the principles on which the transatlantic partnership was founded, namely sovereignty and territory," Mr. Merz said. "We support talks between Denmark, Greenland, the United States on the basis of these principles." Towering snowdrifts bury city on remote Russian peninsula. It's the biggest snowfall the Kamchatka Peninsula has seen in nearly 60 years. By Amy Graff. People on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia have been clearing massive piles of snow this week after several days of severe weather. Many mountains of snow-buried cars, blocked entries to buildings, and covered roofs, bringing life to a standstill in Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, a small city on the remote arm of land jutting out from Russia's far east into icy seas. Emergency services reported that 2 people had been killed by snow falling from rooftops on January 15th, according to RIA Novosti, a Russian state news agency. A state of emergency was announced in the city. The snowfall totals on the peninsula have been unusually high this year, but the situation is not as extreme as depicted in some AI-generated videos circulating on social media, which show apocalyptic scenes of snow rising to the tops of buildings. Some of the clips feature ridiculously unbelievable snow scenes that were created with AI, while some of the footage is probably authentic, said David Robinson, who leads the Global Snow Lab at Rutgers University in Piscataway, New Jersey. Andrei Stepanchuk, who lives in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky and works for a local travel adventure company, also said some of the videos are not authentic. In reality, he said, the snow was rising no higher than the 3rd floor of buildings. He described the snow as nothing catastrophic, but said it was a challenge to clean up so much. An official snow depth of about 5.5 feet was recorded in Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, on January 16th, with that number dropping to 5 feet by January 21st, according to the Hydrometeorological Center of Russia. Videos and photos that were verified by the New York Times showed hills of snow that appear taller than that. They showed snowdrifts, formations created by the wind piling the snow up against obstructions like buildings and fences. Snow does not fall down uniformly flat, said Vladimir Alexeyev, a research professor at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Wind will make those huge snowdrifts. The January snow dump happened after the region had several times its usual amount of snowfall in December. Vera Polyakova, head of the Kamchatka Hydrometeorological Center, said the area had not received that much snow in nearly 60 years, according to RIA Novosti. The Kamchatka Peninsula stretches out into the Sea of Okhotsk and the North Pacific Ocean for nearly 800 miles, nearing the length of California. Its wild and rugged landscape is dotted with active volcanoes and traversed by rivers filled with salmon. It is often the scene of natural disasters. On July 29th, a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck offshore. It was the sixth largest earthquake globally since 1900, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Then, the Krasheninnikov volcano erupted on August 3rd for the first time in at least 400 years, with ash spewing 4 miles into the air, according to the Kronotsky Nature Reserve. In January, the snow has taken center stage. Marty Ralph, the director of the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes at the University of California, San Diego, looked at visualizations of data from the weather models and found that the Kamchatka Peninsula received heavy snowfall from January 12th to 16th. A strong storm pulling in atmospheric river of moisture from the northern Pacific Ocean initially swept the peninsula, followed by a weaker storm. Very low temperatures and strong winds moving over a warmer ocean probably generated more snow, Dr. Ralph said. A similar situation unfolded in the upper portion of lower Alaska this winter, said Dr. Robinson, the Rutgers snow expert. Juneau recorded 82 inches of snow in December, breaking the monthly record as frigid Arctic air interacted with storms pulling atmospheric rivers, according to the National Weather Service. When another storm arrived January 9th and 10th, a mix of snow and rain fell on the snowy landscape, leading to flooding. These are the types of systems you see along the west coast of the lower 48 at times most winters, Dr. Robinson said. The key to the heavy totals was not only the amount of moisture entrained in the rivers, but also their persistence over the same locations for multiple days. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, January 23rd issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening and keep warm.